You wake up tomorrow morning. You use the bathroom. Alone. With a door. You brush your teeth. With actual toothpaste. You make coffee. In your own kitchen. Wearing whatever you slept in. Now imagine doing every part of that in front of 20 strangers. Using a shared stick with a sponge on the end. And then walking to a stone counter in the street for breakfast because your apartment building isn't legally allowed to have a kitchen. That wasn't a bad day for an ancient Roman. That was Tuesday. Let's set the scene, because it's stranger than you think. At its peak, Rome held over 1 million people. That number wouldn't be topped by another European city for over 1,600 years. And they were packed into a space smaller than modern London. Most Romans didn't live in villas with marble floors and personal fountains. That was maybe 2% of the population. Everyone else, the bakers, the soldiers, the shopkeepers, the guy who sold you your sandals, lived in apartment blocks called insulae. Some were 6 stories tall. No elevators. No running water above the ground floor. And this is the part that matters for our story. No kitchens and no private bathrooms anywhere above street level. So the entire morning routine of an ordinary Roman happened outside their front door. Which means the first stop of the day was a building specifically designed for something we now consider the most private act a human being can do. That building was called the Forica. Picture a long stone bench. Rows of evenly spaced holes cut into the top. No dividers. No doors. No curtains. Just you, a hole, and however many other Romans decided to show up at the same time. People sat side by side, doing their business, having full conversations. Talking about the chariot races. Complaining about their landlord. Catching up on gossip. There was no shame in it, because there was no privacy to lose in the first place. If everyone does something in public, it stops being embarrassing. It just becomes Tuesday. And this wasn't a poor people-only situation. The nicest Forica in Rome had marble seating and mosaic floors. Senators used them. Generals used them. Going to the toilet in ancient Rome wasn't a chore you rushed through. It was a social event you could be late for. Now here's where it gets genuinely stranger. And this is the detail that tends to end friendships when you bring it up at dinner. There were no toilet paper alternatives, obviously. This is centuries before paper existed for that purpose. Instead, the Romans used a tool called a tersorium, a stick with a sea sponge tied to the end of it, sitting in a bucket of salt water or vinegar in the corner of the Forica. You used it. You rinsed it in the bucket. You put it back. For the next person. Modern historians actually debate whether shared is fully accurate. Some Forica may have had individual sponges per user, and wealthier Romans sometimes brought their own. But the shared communal version was common enough and gross enough that Roman writers joked about it themselves. Attributed centuries later in a story about a gladiator, describes a man taking his own life with a sponge stick rather than face the arena, which tells you everything about how ordinary and unremarkable that object was in daily Roman life. It wasn't exotic. It was furniture. So Romans weren't shy about the toilet. But here's the twist. They were still terrified of it. Just not for the reason you'd think. Not embarrassment. Monsters. Roman sewers ran directly beneath those toilet holes, connecting to a vast underground network of tunnels. And tunnels, it turns out, are exactly the kind of dark, damp, food-adjacent real estate that rats, snakes, and insects love to move into. There are Roman writings describing creatures crawling up through the toilet holes mid-use. Snakes surfacing between someone's legs. That is a real historical anxiety, not a modern exaggeration. So the Romans did what people have always done with a fear they can't fully control. They made it religious. There are records of Romans muttering quick prayers before sitting down, asking for protection from whatever might be underneath them. And there was an actual goddess assigned to the job, Cloacina, whose name literally translates to roughly, she who cleanses, or she of the sewer. She had a small shrine near the forum, right by the main sewer's outflow point, and Romans leaving the toilet would sometimes pay quick respects on the way out. Somewhere in history, a goddess's entire job description was, keep the snakes away from people's ankles. That was a real position in the Roman religious hierarchy. And that sewer wasn't some small drainage ditch. It had a name, and it had a legend. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, built starting around the 6th century BC. That's over 2,500 years ago, originally to drain marshland, so Rome could even be built in the first place. Over time, it was expanded into a stone tunnel system large enough, in places, for a cart to drive through. Here's the part that should sound impossible. Parts of the Cloaca Maxima are still functioning today, not as a museum piece, as actual working infrastructure, still carrying runoff beneath modern Rome, over 2,000 years after it was built. Roman legend held that anything thrown into the sewer, bad luck, curses, even unwanted newborns in the darkest historical accounts, vanished into the underworld itself. The sewer wasn't just plumbing to them. It was the literal boundary between the world of the living and whatever waited underneath the city. Modern engineers have gone down there. It's still standing. Ancient concrete, holding up a modern capital city, built by people who didn't have steel, didn't have machinery, and were reportedly too afraid of what lived inside it to go check on their own work very often. Toilet handled. Time for breakfast. If you had one at all, plenty of Romans skipped it or grabbed something small, but let's say you're hungry. Remember, no kitchen. Fire in a 6-story wooden-framed apartment building was an actual, recorded, catastrophic risk. Rome had already burned down once, badly, and nobody wanted a repeat starting in someone's rented room. So breakfast meant going out to a Thermopolium. Think of it as ancient Rome's answer to a street food counter. A stone structure built directly into the sidewalk, with large ceramic pots called dolia embedded into circular holes in the countertop. Each pot held something different: hot lentils, chickpea stew, warm spiced wine, salted fish. You didn't sit down. You didn't get a menu. You walked up, pointed, paid a few coins, and ate standing in the street on your way to wherever you were going. Genuinely, structurally, almost identical to grabbing a coffee before work today. And we're not guessing about any of this. In Pompeii, buried and perfectly preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, archaeologists excavated a Thermopolium so intact that traces of the actual food were still sitting in the pots. Duck bone, fava beans, snail shells, a frozen snapshot of someone's actual breakfast order, unchanged for nearly 2,000 years. One more detail, because it's too good to leave out. Roman law actually regulated these places. There are records of fines for shortchanging customers and for serving food that had gone bad, which means somewhere in the Roman Republic, there was a bureaucrat whose entire job was ancient Yelp reviews, checking that your lentil stew wasn't a scam. Now, a detail most people never learn, and one that will absolutely ruin your image of a clean, sophisticated Roman morning. Romans cared a lot about white teeth. Whitening was a real cultural value. But the whitening agent of choice wasn't mint, or chalk, or anything you'd expect. It was urine. Specifically, ammonia from aged urine, which really does have a bleaching effect. Roman laundries used it to clean and whiten togas, and dentists, such as they were, used diluted urine as a mouth rinse and tooth whitening agent. It got so popular that the Emperor Vespasian placed a tax on public urine collection. People paid to gather urine from public latrines and sell it to laundries and dental services. That tax was controversial enough that Vespasian's own son complained about it, and Vespasian's reply became a famous Latin phrase still quoted today: pecunia non olet. Money doesn't smell. So somewhere in Rome, on your walk to breakfast, you may have passed a small business that existed purely to collect, tax, and resell urine for oral hygiene. That's not a joke embellishment. That's an actual, taxed, government-regulated Roman industry. Here's a part of the Roman morning that had nothing to do with hygiene and everything to do with status. If you were an ordinary Roman with any ambition at all, your morning likely included something called the Salutatio, literally, the greeting. Before sunrise, you'd walk to the home of your patron, a wealthier, more powerful Roman who you depended on for loans, legal help, or a good word in the right ear. You'd line up, sometimes with dozens of other people, all waiting for a few minutes of FaceTime. The bigger and more important your patron, the longer and more crowded that line. In return, you were expected to greet him publicly, escort him around town for part of the day if asked, and generally exist as visible proof that he had followers. It was social currency, traded in person, every single morning, rain or shine. Skip too many mornings, and your patron might quietly stop returning favors. Show up faithfully for years, and you might get introduced to someone even more powerful. An entire economy of favors, obligation, and quiet status anxiety, running before most Romans had even eaten breakfast. And if you had no patron, no favors, and no savings? Those six-story insulae weren't just cramped. They were dangerous. Landlords built cheap and fast, cutting corners on materials to maximize rent from as many tiny rooms as possible. Collapses were common enough to be recorded as routine news, not shocking disasters. Fires spread fast through wood-framed floors packed with oil lamps and cooking braziers smuggled in against the rules. The wealthy, meanwhile, lived at street level, in solid stone domus houses, about as far from the risk as physically possible. Your address in Rome wasn't just where you lived. It was a fairly accurate prediction of how safe your morning was going to be. So here's everything stacked together. No private bathroom, a shared sponge, a sewer full of snakes, urine as toothpaste, a status anxiety lineup before sunrise, and a building that might genuinely fall down on you. By any modern standard, that sounds like the worst place on earth to wake up. Except Rome was, for nearly 500 years, the most advanced city that had ever existed. And buried inside that chaotic morning was something almost every Roman had access to, that most of human history never did. Clean water. Every day. For free. 11 aqueducts fed the city of Rome, carrying an estimated 300 million gallons of fresh water daily. Some estimates run even higher. Public fountains ran continuously, 24 hours a day, fed entirely by gravity across incredible distances. You didn't haul water from a river. You didn't boil it to be safe. You walked to the corner, and it was simply there, clean, cold, and free for anyone. For most of human history, in most parts of the world, clean water has been the single most valuable, most fought-over resource a person could have. Rome piped it into the street corner and gave it away to slaves and senators alike. So picture the full Roman morning, one more time, all the way through. Wake up in a 6-story building with no kitchen and no private toilet. Walk to the Forica, sit next to a stranger, use the shared sponge. Rinse your mouth with someone's aged urine on the way to breakfast. Stand at a stone counter eating lentil stew off the street. Wait in a line to greet a man richer than you. Walk home past a building that might not be standing next year. Then stop at a fountain and drink water cleaner than what most of the modern world has today. We built the private bathroom. They built the aqueduct. We eat alone in our kitchens. They ate standing together in the street. We whiten our teeth with chemicals from a lab. They whiten them with a taxed government resource that, respectfully, we are not going to try at home. The Romans weren't primitive. They were just organized around a completely different set of priorities than we are. And somehow, on the one thing that actually keeps people alive, they solved it better than most of the world still has, 2,000 years later. Right now, in the year you're watching this, over 2 billion people on Earth still don't have reliable access to safe drinking water. The Romans solved that problem in a city of 1 million people, using nothing but gravity, stone, and lead pipe, 2,000 years ago. And somewhere between then and now, most of the world forgot how.